Introduction to NetBackup. Now, when it comes to data security and integrity, one of the most important things you can do as an administrator is to back up your data. Backing up data is only part of the solution, of course. You also need to ensure that your backups are good, current, and most importantly, they're able to be restored when you need to call on them. NetBackup by Veritas is one of the top 3 backup products available today, but like any good backup solution, it does require a bit of forethought and configuration. So before we get started with installing the product itself, let's take a quick look at the requirements that you'll need to meet before you can even think about backing up your data. Firstly, you're going to need a server to install it on, but that's rather obvious. However, this server will require at least 64 megs of RAM on top of your regular system RAM, although realistically, you'll want at least 512 meg to a gigabyte of RAM if you're installing NetBackup into an enterprise environment. You'll also need Internet Explorer version 5.5 or above, and you'll want to install NetBackup on an NTFS partition that has at least 575 megs of free disk space and around 500 more for temporary storage if you're upgrading from a previous version of NetBackup. Now, these requirements are the minimums, and I doubt that in any serious enterprise environment nowadays you wouldn't easily exceed them. So with these requirements in the back of our minds, let's begin and install the product. Now, when you pop in the NetBackup CD, if you have auto run enabled, you'll be presented with the NetBackup splash screen like you see here. Now, from here we can install the product, we can view the documentation that comes included on the NetBackup CD, and we also have some hyperlinks here that'll take you off to the Veritas website for some more assistance and information about NetBackup. So we want to install our NetBackup server, so we'll come up to the top here and we'll click on the NetBackup installation link. And then we're given options to install the NetBackup server, client, or the Java display console for Windows operating systems. Alright, well, it's a server that we want to install, so we'll click on Install Server Software. And we'll get a message telling us that setup will need to configure our system to prepare it for installation, and that's just really a funky way of telling you that it needs to copy some files to our server and start the Windows installer. So I'll click OK to continue, and in a moment this will fire up the Windows installer and then launch into the installation wizard. Okay, the wizard started, so we'll click Next, and then we'll need to agree with the terms set out in the license agreement, so I'll just click I accept and then click Next. Alright, now we can choose to install NetBackup on this server or a remote server if we prefer, or even perhaps a clustered server if that's an option. Now, you'll note, however, that this option is grayed out for me, and that's because I'm not running this installation on a server that is a member of a cluster. Anyway, I want to install NetBackup on this server, so I'll leave the default selection to install to this server only, and then we'll click Next. Alright, now once you enter in your license key up the top here, then these next 2 options here will be made available to you. The first option is to install a NetBackup master server, which you'll need to have installed before you can install the next option, which is to install a NetBackup media server, which you'll use to control tape devices and track where your media is. Now, without your license key entered in here, the only option you will have is to install the NetBackup Remote Administration Console, which administrators can use to manage NetBackup servers remotely. Alright, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video here, I'm going to enter in my license key up the top here, and then I'll click on the first option here, the NetBackup Master Server. Alright, now we can install a typical installation of NetBackup or a custom installation if we'd like to add or remove any component of NetBackup. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Custom so we can see what options we have, and then we'll click Next. Now, you'll note here that by default we'll be installing NetBackup, and if we expand this option here, you can also see that we're going to be installing the NetBackup documentation. Now, we won't be installing the NetBackup debugger symbols, which we can use to assist us in troubleshooting problems that arise with NetBackup. And finally, we'll also be installing the NetBackup snapshot provider, and this is a newer feature of NetBackup as it assists NetBackup in backing up files that are currently open and in use. Now, the default installation for NetBackup, as you can see, is in the Program Files directory on your system drive, which in my case is my C drive, and I'm happy with that location, but you can change this if you prefer to install NetBackup into a different folder or drive by simply coming over here, clicking on the Change button, and then specifying an alternate path. Alright, well I'm happy with these defaults, so I'll click Next, and then we'll be asked to define which account will be responsible for running our NetBackup services. Now the default is to use the system account, but you can uncheck this box and then specify an account of your own choice if you prefer. Now these services will default to an automatic startup type, but you can change this to manual if you prefer, but I certainly wouldn't recommend that you go ahead and change your setting. And finally, the default setting is for NetBackup services to be automatically started once our installation is complete. So I'll leave these settings as they are, as they already represent the best configuration, and I'll click Next. Okay, now we can specify which ports that NetBackup will use for these services, and as you can see, there are a lot of them here, so unless you specifically have a need, most times you won't change these, perhaps unless you have another application already using one of these ports, or you need to use specific ports to get through a firewall. But if you happen to change one of these, and then you realize that you made a mistake, simply click on the default ports button, and then all of these port numbers will be reset back to their values you see here. Alright, so I'll leave this as it is, and we'll click Next. Now we need to enter in the names of systems that will be allowed to access this NetBackup server. We can see that this server is called DC, but if you have multiple NetBackup servers that you want to be able to access this server, simply enter in the names down here, and then separate them with a comma if you have more than one. Okay, so we'll click Next, and we'll need to define our global device database host. Now this is simply a server that maintains a database of all devices that NetBackup knows about. Now seeing as this is our first server, I'll leave the default as it is, but if this happens to be just another NetBackup server joining your existing servers and you already have a preferred global device server, then you can enter in the name of that server up here. So I'll click Next, and then if everything's okay, simply click on Install. Now this will take a while to install, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video here and we'll return once our installation is complete. Okay, our installation is finished and everything's been installed successfully. Now when we click Finish, the default is for our NetBackup administration console to be started up. So for now, I'm just going to uncheck this box and then we can click Finish. Now as you've seen, installing NetBackup, it's a pretty simple task. In our next video, we'll take a closer look at configuring our NetBackup server and NetBackup clients so we can begin to use the product for its intended purpose, which of course is to back up our critical data.